very fortunate to have the chief curator of the Biennale taking us around. But Jitish, of course, is a famous artist, and we're old friends. And he's not only an artist, and he's also a writer. He's a pontificator. He makes a lot of projects. Some of these friends you've met before, from Taiwan, from China, and from Malaysia. So, thank you very much for looking after us today.
Thank you. Well, I mean, the thing is, this biennial has about 94 artists, 100 projects, spread across 8 venues. This is the first project right behind us. In a sense, it takes the whole circle to become 69 projects here. 70th is a standalone space, and they're on. So in fact, what we'll see is whatever we can see in about an 2-hour, 2.5-hour period. And I thought, rather than run from rooms and jump between spaces, we'll see as far as we can get, rather than essentially, trying to get to specific works or, well, really, in terms of, for those of you who may know of this biennial, it's initiated in 2012 by 2 artist colleagues, Bose Krishnamachari and Riaz Komu. So it's an artist-initiated project. And really, in its very first edition, had pretty much been hugely embraced by the local audiences. So I think one of the big successes was the great audience right behind us. We have school groups, and this goes on through the day. I mean, every day we have groups like this. So that's something I inherited, a biennial that had actually sort of made a certain forged a relationship with the community as much as it did also with the art world in its very first edition. But for me, really, the question was, how does one take off from there, and really where does one find a vocabulary for a project that can continue, and how does one extend its grammar through whatever one does? Every gesture one makes here is one step in the narrative of this biennial's future, and also how does it become fruitful and meaningful as an enterprise to think and think together. So for me, the questions I was asking were all in the early hours of the morning. I would take early morning walks the first week of actually taking on this role. And if one does that in Kochi, you get taken back 300, 400 years, sometimes 500, 600, 700 years. You don't go back much further than that. But there's a residual architectural ruin, or the even restored architecture takes you back 500 years. And equally, the waters carry narratives that several of us are familiar with, of these landing spaces where lots of transactions have occurred on these very coastlines. So really one cluster, so the process really for me was to actually reach out to artists, not with a firm curatorial note which actually prescribes a pathway with a definite end. So I'd often say that I would like the biennial to produce themes rather than reproduce a single proposed curatorial theme. So the letters really were often clusters of images. Of course, in text form, they were really letters. They would change from artist to artist often. But 2 suggestions remained consistent in all the letters. One was a reflection on this moment of great maritime movement, the 14th to the 17th century, where essentially with every movement of a ship, maps were changing, and really in that ever-shifting geography was ever-shifting turns in history through which we kind of inherit, and we can actually trace back embryonic form of the world we inhabit, perhaps in several moments in history, but one amongst them being clearly a moment of Kochi's own reincarnation across those 3 centuries. But what was interesting for me was also that alongside this terrestrial narrative that all of us are, of course, familiar with, was also a slightly lesser familiar piece of, overlapping episode in Kerala's own sort of intellectual history was this great activity of the Kerala School of Astronomy and Mathematics, often now described as the Kerala School of Astronomy and Mathematics, making propositions of where we are located in the cosmos as a kind of wider framework of how do we find an address for our own existence, and equally making propositions for trigonometry and calculus 200 years before counterparts in Europe. And to me, both of these became like a compelling sets of thoughts to begin a process. So the letters to artists doesn't actually cite the Kerala School of Astronomy and Mathematics, actually just says that we contemplate alongside this navigational history this moment here, for instance, standing here, all of us have the sense of being static, whereas we know that while we are here, we are hurtling through space at 100,000 kilometers per hour in directions we don't know where. And perhaps it's just that sort of, momentary shift of our own glance of this present moment that might reconstitute ideas we live with as a broad proposition of perhaps thinking of the own limits of our perception as one of the themes that could possibly recur. So in fact, for the first 6 months, it was really a volley of intuitions that were going out of me and coming back in conversations, in inboxes. And the next 6 months were really tangibly working with the objects and the architecture. So really then it's all spatial, and now we'll kind of maybe try and catch some of the projects as far as we can get. Should we begin with, so this is the first piece. This might, shall we go in first? Yeah, and we can come back. This is starting right now.
1 meter wide, which we view from just 1 meter away. Now every 10 seconds we will look from 10 times farther away, and our field of view will be 10 times wider. This square is 10 meters wide, and in 10 seconds the next square will be 10 times as wide. Our picture will center on the pictures, even after they've been lost to sight. 100 meters wide, the distance a man can walk. That our belongs to the a fringe of a myriad comets too faint to see completes the solar system. Ten to the 14th. As the solar system shrinks to one bright point in the distance, our sun is plainly now only one among the stars. Looking back from here, we know 4 southern constellations, still much as they appear from the far side of the Earth. This square is 10 to the 16 meters, one light year, not yet out to the next star. Our last 10-second step took us 10 light years further. The next will be 100. Our perspective changes so much in each step now that even the background stars will appear to converge. Flat spiral facing us. The time and path we chose to leave Chicago has brought us out of the galaxy along a course nearly perpendicular to its disk. Now we reduce the distance to our final destination by 90% every 10 seconds. Each step much smaller.
So this is, of course, it was conceived in the late 60s, at the first moment when Blue Marble. This is the 77 version of the same thing. So. Sorry, Ashish, you were asking. I just thought we got an opportune moment to enter. You were saying something? No, I wanted to about the design. I kind of inherited the designation of the Biennale in a sense. Or should we discuss this tomorrow? Or we can. Very from broadly, to just answer very briefly, there was some peculiar poetry in having an appendage which doesn't exist. Rather than actually trying to be, trying to be descriptive about it or trying to actually see Zeros out as a project. For me, it became like, probably the only biennial in the world that has half its name in a place that doesn't exist at all, and in a sense becomes like a, like a hyphenation to the idea of transience, which pretty much runs through the project. The idea of time, transience, is a recurrent theme, and you see it maybe in the later works in the Biennale. But yeah. And also, in some ways, you see it in certain pieces, like Sahaj's work. There are works that try to sort of, connect it. But personally, I just found it as an interesting idea, rather than as a particular space to kind of. These are the sort of single-word minimalist poems of American poet Aram Saroyan. These are pieces from the 60s. Aram is a very active poet and had several recent 2014 poems with me too, but it just made a lot of sense to go back to work which is absolutely seminal in terms of the way it also impacts visual arts coming from the field of poetry. So in fact there are often typographical errors of sorts, or there are words that slip away from being a normal word, doubling or becoming malignant bigger words, like I becomes EY, you can't read it. Or light becomes like a refracted image of light in the way the letters double up. Or M, often credited as the smallest poem ever written, is not an M but birthing an N at the same time, and often described as an extended hum of the universe. But there are lots of trivia around these poems as well, because sometime in the late 60s, Light was actually awarded $750 by the National Endowment for the Arts, and created a huge furor, for instance, amongst poets, because how could you actually have such a big figure attached to a word? It became the most expensive word ever written. And so Aram actually in his time was a really interesting figure, pretty much pushing the limits. But you see him reincarnate a lot in visual arts today, actually making the shift, not just through concrete poetry, but really within visual arts. Mona Hatoum, many of you may be familiar with. Mona was here until 2 days ago and delivered a beautiful talk. Mona's work often transforms everyday objects and experiences into objects of tremendous beauty, but at the same time often have an undertone of a very turbulent undertone, a disturbing undertone, or this one, of course, is almost like a carpet of wires entwined into each other with a single sort of electricity source that almost at the speed of breath illuminates, brightens, and then dims again, and could develop tremendous sort of overlay of images in our minds as we look at them, and that's really what Mona does with most of her work.
I have another work of hers in
the Darban.
And you have a number of artists who you have actually shown across the Biennale.
Yes.
Why was that?
For Mona, for instance, the other piece actually is they're maps. They're in-flight magazine maps that she actually fills in color in the gaps when two flights intersect. The space created is what she colors up, and eventually, at the end of it, becomes a drawing that actually erases national boundaries and begins to appear a bit like weather reports on a television, where natural elements really ignore all visa laws and borders and territories. But what she does is simply, spend time on an aircraft doing something rather simple and beautiful, and opens up several narratives around nation and borders, and again, a very recurrent motive in her work, and even a recurrent methodology where the gesture is small and the kind of result is something far more wide. And so, again, Aram Saroyan recurs again a bit like punctuations. You encounter his words, but there's Michael Stevens, which you'll read later. Michael becomes almost like a thought station, like a extended punctuation. I think the sound will get recorded actually. No? Do you think sound will be catching while we are speaking? Oh, it is. Okay. So, Nataraj actually began with this body of work began almost a decade ago with a series of paintings called Alternate Shapes for the Earth. The title remained the same, and those were paintings really. And at the time of the Gujarat riots, he was toying with the idea of the worldview as a shape, and so really trying to reshape the world is where it all began. And simultaneously, it was triggered by a drawing he made for his daughter explaining the eclipse. So it actually had this sort of double genesis in a way for him, which then became sculptures. And the first series of sculptures actually had like a blue planet shaped, but it's interesting here that it's purely kind of just the metal, and on a close viewing it appears like completely dehydrated planet Earth, devoid of any water, and just the texture of really maps and land masses placed on a sculptor's working deck, almost as if some sort of divine world maker, twice human scale, that might actually animate life into these shapes. All kinds of other imagery, the idea of the clockwork perhaps, all kinds of mechanisms which don't essentially function but appear like they're serving a purpose. These are the drawings of Madhusudanan. Some of you maybe, I'm sure Ashish is familiar with Madhu's work. Do you want to speak about it? Filmmaker, works between drawing and filmmaking. But really this becomes, I think, for him too a big step forward in his own sort of drawing practice, where it's really the largest portfolio he's made. And very evident, some of the images obviously pretty make explicit his ideological bent in a sense. A lot of his filmmaking also connects to the left movement in a way. But these were actually conceived almost and also displayed a bit like a storyboard or even like a film strip. Madhu actually spoke about the very early sort of first drawing, almost seeming to him like the image of a tower close to his home that would often illuminate his surrounding, and he almost had that as a starting point to actually begin finding a language for these images. If we can see.
Good time also to say something about the presence of Kerala artists. I mean, this has been Kochi Muzaira's focus area, right? Using artists from Kerala or about Kerala.
It made some sense, and partly it was probably also.
So for everyone's benefit, Madhu was one of the founders of the Kerala radicals, with KP Krishna Kumar. He was the other big figure at that point of time. So for that reason I asked.
So in fact, it was interesting to revisit different generations of artists from Kerala. So we have, for instance, someone who actually in the art world we'd be quite unfamiliar with. But I was really happy to discover the impact, say somebody like Nambudri, who is primarily an illustrator, but a really respectable, remarkable illustrator, and the impact he's had on figuration amongst artists. And I spoke to artists of Madhu's generation, and some of them said their first image of Dracula came from Nambudri. So it was almost a way of imagining the way of drawing a figure. So it was great to go back to figures like that, or Punnalur, Rajan Punnalur, whose photographic work is really a chronicle of Kerala, a chronicle of his own life, a life that in a way sits somewhere in between figures in the cultural field and figures in the political fraternity. So he was hanging out both with the artists and the politicians, and I think that's really a portfolio of Kerala from two ends. But those come far in the, I don't think we'll get that far today. But should we see Yan Singh sir? And it might be. With almost a circular cluster of rice grains. We've seen a few circles as we walked in, so there's a kind of, I think, invokes when you see the start of the video, pretty much the circle of a planet Earth, slowly pecked away across 9 or 10 minutes, 922 rice corns that make that circle disappear. But in the meantime, we actually see this record of the activity of disappearance, really with the hen and the cockerel, really in a sort of minor battle. She's always pushed aside, pretty much all through, but she's always ahead in the task she's at. The number's always ahead of her. And many of these works have in some ways another reincarnation to a completely different work elsewhere in the show. For instance, Rivani Noiswanda, a Brazilian artist's work, which we probably may not get to, is a projection of almost like a mappa mundi, a map of the world, where the map is made of honey, and what you have is this absolutely brisk movement of hands, almost like navigators, as if the entire history of maritime navigation was frozen across a 9-minute time lapse. But in that movement, erases the entire world because they are constantly pecking away at the honey. And so it comes much, much later in the show, but maybe there's a point of recall when some of these earlier works find another incarnation. You've had that dream as well. Yeah, this history of mortality,
You know,
fatality.
have you seen the short film you made about that barber?
Yes.
Well, that was part of the You Don't Belong package, and that was the only film that the Chinese censors had a problem with in Shanghai. Strangely enough.
Really?
Yeah, they
Maybe they checked him out and said,
I don't know why.
Spectres of Marx.
Spectres of Marx. But this is that. He got quite excited by that knowledge.
Yes. We discussed that film early on as a possible.
In Shanghai, they had, was it Guangzhou? Sorry, Guangzou. When they had the film festival of documentary films, this film of this man, Madhusudanan, they cancelled it. In Guangzhou.
It's appropriate.
This is like a leisure.
Touching the artworks is not uncommon. But so David Horowitz, very young and interesting American artist, makes what he calls a journey and comes to the word jour, the day, a day trip, the distance you could travel in a day is apparently how the word was formed. When he travels to the other end of where his mother was located, his mother was located in California, and he flew all the way to the Maldives and shot the sunrise and the sunset at two ends of the world using iPhones at the same time. And it's kind of played back on the iPhones in a way. So it's, if you spend a few minutes, we actually just see the same sun go from one side to the other. And it's actually one of the smallest pieces in the show. But I was hoping it's kind of, speaks to this kind of the phantom planet in a way. The straight line is yet another illusion of the flat world. But to see that alongside this timeline, which is Berry Velarde, Swiss artist, and it's a timeline of this century and beyond, to science fiction or projections from the last century and before in film and books. So it's essentially our present from the past, viewed from the past, which was then its future. So in a way it kind of conflates past, present, future.
And I think I've seen it in a book where she's exhibited this alongside little screens of sci-fi movies. There's this new trend of retrofuturism, of how the future was imagined 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So it also brings into play various imaginations of the future set in the timeline. So in 2049, or Total Recall, I think, was set around this time. According to Total Recall or Back to the Future, we should have had flying cars by now. So it actually brings all of those into the same composition.
When was Total Recall set?
I think it was set around 2048 or something. So in another 20 years' time, we should be expecting...
Like some author from the last century has imagined that by absolute negligence we've blown up the moon.
What about the Third World War, no?
There's a Third World War. There's 2015 as a single currency. So in fact, 2006 was when she made the piece. But following the invitation, she kind of reincarnated the piece in a way. So all the handwritten text is actually from 2014. Okay. That's really the
like an
extended version. Yeah. So this is now the 2014 version.
2050 Harry Baweja released. I don't know whether you guys saw that film.
You recommend? We guys would be together. No, I keep looking for you. Now this is Aji Vien, artist from Kerala, but now currently based largely in Rotterdam and splits time with Kerala. It works between landscapes and these kind of portraits that you actually also cannot place in any time. So what I like about these landscapes is, until you find a small form of like a home or something, some human habitation, it could be from a distant apocalyptic future or even a pre-habitation past. Or even when you find habitation, they sort of, you wonder if it's the illumination that's actually extends out of these homes into the sky. And it's a kind of blurry landscape. And I just thought, if you actually read much of what you accumulate as imagery from Berry Velarde, this becomes the kind of point to maybe even offload that imagery into Aji's really fantastic charcoal and Conte drawings. So these are Sushanta Mandal, works 3 sort of bodies of work in a way. And Sushanta works with sort of handmade devices. I mean, he actually creates these mechanisms himself. And they are fragile, almost made in a minute kind of sculptures that emerge out of soap, water, becomes films of soap. That depending on, in fact, it's all randomized. So, you know, sometimes it's pulled so far apart that it grows big but collapses and is extremely like a transient. Sometimes they die because somebody blows air at them, you know, or they refract and almost catch rainbows and spectrums at various points depending on where you stand. So
It's amazing.
extremely delicate. And, you know, sometimes you can see yourself in it. And those pieces, again, it's like a ever-emerging constellation of bubbles that the same device that produces it also destroys it. Or even here you have a similar related scenario where this kind of the point of beginning is this very point of end kind of turning of a bubble. Although Sushanta doesn't, and I really enjoy his work for that. I mean, he doesn't actually inject any imagery, and he enjoys the fact that you just see them for what they are. And I think that's the meditative stillness in which I think these works are made. But sorry,
Bare machinery.
Bare, absolutely. You know. And but this one in particular always, in a way, triggered this image of, you know, these celestial navigation charts. You know, just a few metal rods put together, bamboo sticks tied together that people use to travel great distances. So I think of those rectangular travel charts that, you know, navigators of a certain time use. And in fact, that remained in my mind quite a lot while actually making this relationship, where you have Adrian Pachi's The Column, a 26-minute long video, very slow, meditative in a way that it actually attends to the movement of the sun, it attends to the morning, the afternoon and the night, the movement of the workers who actually load the ship with a huge piece of marble and begin carving as the ship leaves. So in fact, the cargo time becomes workshop time, maritime and manufacture time converge, and as he calls it, in this perverse accelerated world. But what I actually really love about the work is, you know, you are actually attending to all the elements around it in absolute slowness to think of acceleration. But you also, of course, think of what are the conditions, what are the labor laws at sea, for instance. You know, so I think it's also deeply political without actually making any of those remarks in any way. I don't cite those either. But, you know, so in fact, just to kind of let the mind, you know, think about them.
Genuine and I had a discussion about this work because we actually started with thinking, or at least we were given to understand that this is a work of fiction that is actually done for the camera, and then it turned out to be a work that is effectively a documentary.
It's recreated for. So in fact, it's absolutely. He heard about this apparently, and then he recommissioned the process.
But that must, I mean, if he commissioned it, must have been like one of those $1 million projects or something.
Must have been it must have been an expensive project. In a way, I mean, the sculpture that eventually came out of
he commissioned the boat and commissioned
the making, and in fact produced what was the column that also became the sculpture. So in its certain iterations, it's also been shown along with the actual column, but it's also been shown without the column.
I see.
Sun and the Earth.
Oh yeah,
Christian
Walbrook.
Walbrook.
He took a year to convince us to Air Force. We'll get there, I think. You know, we have a little bit of time to reach that far.
So there is a lot of investment going into something.
He's Michael Stevens that Ashish was just mentioning amongst the artists that recur. So Michael comes up 6 times, and so Michael actually has never been seen really in an art space, and he's essentially a blogger. So the place to find him is YouTube, and he often begins with a very simple question like, "Is anything real? Is what goes on in this room, or what if the Earth stopped turning in the very next room?" and what will we miss 50 years from now, 100 years from now, 1,000, 5,000, a million, and 3 billion years when Andromeda and Milky Way galaxy have danced around each other and our galaxy wouldn't exist and you'd have Milky Andromeda. So in fact really projecting as far as that, speculating if we'd be around at all. So in a way I think it takes in through speculations of fragment of real information that gets clustered in his commentary to become works of philosophy, poetry, prank, but clearly works of performance. He's a phenomenal artist. Yeah, he's a great guy.
So he's not an artist.
He's not an artist at all. So in fact, when I actually reached out, I remember a mail from Samantha as assistant saying that we actually were just thinking that Michael is indeed an artist. And, I said he indeed is. And
So how many, if I might ask, if you can do a quantification, how many people have you included in the Biennale who do not describe themselves as artists?
Well, so there's, say, Aram, if you think of him as a poet, but, a poet who, of course, absolutely brushes the edge of visual arts, or at least gives it a push in certain ways. There's Cecil Tola, who actually is very active in the visual arts, but actually works with smell primarily. Christian Walvogel himself, the gentleman who, great friend who takes a flight, at the speed of Zurich on top of Zurich, is actually a trained architect and finds his way into the art world through being invited for the Venice Architecture Biennale, where he presented actually something that's really an act of art, a proposal of actually sending out all the magma from planet Earth to create greater floor space, greater FSI, a bigger Earth to accommodate more people. So in fact that pushed him into the field of visual arts immediately, and he realized that's where his heart lies. So and that's now what's happening is really the dance of galaxies. What's been incredible is really how the local audiences have really spent time with these works. Especially in that week between Christmas and New Year when we had 6,000 people a day. The whole Biennale was full of people. So these rooms would be full and you'd have people outside watching through the window, which is just incredible. It's truly
These are
satisfying.
on YouTube, and I remember some curator saying, if it's already on YouTube, then why? But I saw that people watching these together is itself an important thing,
And I think
because
then-
it changes the dynamics of the reception of such
Yes.
videos that are circulating on YouTube.
And in fact, I could probably have more than half of Michael Stevens' work proliferate. There's actually a whole ecosystem of interesting bloggers that I was looking at, and then started zeroing in fact on Michael as probably the most interesting figure in terms of really how he animates our imagination. But for me, this is really a great invitation to to somebody to do a Michael Stevens retrospective at home. Sort of take it on their own desktop and
and have it collectively viewed.
Yes. Yeah.
Is he a video blogger or he also writes?
He writes the text to blog. So in fact it's absolutely scripted. It's we spend some time, in fact, interesting the YouTube office because we happen to be in New York at the same time. He lives in London. So he actually it's a fully framed performance. There's nothing left to chance.
He's got a YouTube channel.
He edits himself, so he actually works like an artist. Keeps gathering informations. When they bubble up and become one, that's when it becomes a blog, and he's very prolific.
All these are like what if one.
And we actually exchange. In fact, one of the ways in which, in several instances with artists, they were often, me working with my own intuitions as prompts, as points of dialogue. So, for instance, if it was Bijoy Jain, along with my email invitation were actually JPEGs of ballast stones from around Kochi that came in Dutch ships. As a way of saying hello and let's begin a discussion on time and history and masonry, But Vijay is in CSI Bungalow. Yeah, there's actually a cluster of works that actually, in some ways, connect around the idea of architecture, but not directly. But also Michael Stevens in that space, asking how high can we build, and he builds all the way to moon and beyond. And each act of building relocates our relationship with all the other forces. So for instance, he asks simple questions like, do you want to see the sunset twice? If you do, you lie down, and as the sun just sets, stand up. You'll see one more sunset. Or the fact that people below and on top of Burj Khalifa at two different moments when they broke their fast, and there's absolutely diktat in the newspaper giving them different timings for breaking fast. So all of these things cluster up, and in some ways you see the imagery there around the sunset, which might trigger a David Horowitz moment, again. So the exhibition, in a way, the structure is really a wall. I mean, the things keep recurring back many, many times.
Can you try that tongue thing?
It works?
It works, yeah. I mean, at least if you twist your tongue fully upside down, then and you touch this side and this side, you actually lose your right and left. Wow. So if you touch here, it's actually right. Okay. We've got a whole thing on this.
They also eventually become, I think, a lot of abstraction in them. I mean, if you look at the entire body of work, but the references can be either images of great distances, almost, mixing the microscope with the telescope of sorts, in a way. So that you have the astrolabe, you have inside the human body. What looks absolutely like a pattern there is actually movement of subatomic particles, and so in a way, it's a cluster of many, many images. But I think kind of from firm existing images, I think kind of seeking out to become abstractions in a way. They're really painstakingly done. If you kind of go close, it's almost like stippling a dot at a time, kind of returning back to really sort of artisanal skills of drawing and kind of.
So what image of the
microscope?
So the whole thing is it's an Amazon sort of expanded.
Yeah, and this is like maybe what you're thinking about Sandbite.
This is terrific for this. Whole thing. Actually, what is his responsibility?
This was done in real time over. Yeah, it's a 24-hour performance that became a 24-hour video. And in fact, just talking about, say, this notion of recurrence in the CSI bungalow, where this Bijoy's work is also there. He's a kind of connection to architecture. There we have also Mark Wallinger, whose the activity in the video is the same. It's scaffolding makers building a scaffold. They take about 40 minutes to build, and by the time they hoist the scaffold, it aligns with the top of the horizon. And so while they build and they walk over and below, they actually walk alongside ships on the horizon line. And actually, if we've been watching the seas, in that modernist grid of the scaffold, you actually see like numerous ships over 40 minutes that go through. They actually unfold that scaffold and leave. It takes an hour. So in a way, at that moment, perhaps also a convergence of what we just saw, a Janine Amdoni with a Mark Formanak, one act of building and yet another descending onto the horizon, and entirely scaling both the human body and as well as a piece of architecture in relationship to a wide open landscape, really different scaling. It's pleasing. Something she also mixes up in terms of really the imagery that, of course, connect to the idea of the maritime, the notions of trade, but also reflect on how, in fact, even dyeing techniques were battlegrounds for colonial rulers in a way that you maybe held back certain forms of dyeing and weaving to actually manage your own industry. And so she actually thinks of all of these histories. So it's nice to kind of see them alongside real ships that go all the time.
I was just thinking about
Sanjeev Patwardhan's astronaut from here. In fact, that and this I've been struggling with, and I've several times wanted to just stick a wood in it. Because that, when you look back, you also see the single sail.
Okay.
So it's like a cross reading of the two sight lines.
Right.
But this has gone bad. This is
Only so much you can.
no, we can actually put. I've said to the volunteers many times. Just keep
But this is a special printing process.
maybe at night
Based on
things are very
experience.
sorry.
This process of printing or this
Yeah,
sci-fi,
yeah,
very
exactly.
interesting thing.
Yes.
It's really about exposure to light. It's almost like a photographic technique using dyes.
But it's an Asian traditional.
It's pretty old.
Pretty old. Yeah, it's like 2000 years.
And in fact, I remember sharing with Shumon like pictures like this, a panorama. Because the question really was that for the integrity of the photograph, you either board up the window, but you lose this great relational and contextual sort of possibility you have in a space like this. And it was a hard decision. I wanted to have him make the decision, because this is what I always preferred, that even if you actually see the reflection, you struggle to see the photograph, you can actually see the photograph, but then you can actually come in front of it and see the reflection. So it served both ways. If boarded up, it becomes a photo gallery. Then you can actually control light and reflection and everything, but you lose this great relationship. So these were actually pictures taken at Chittagong, at one of the largest shipbreaking yards. And it's interesting that they also, connect to this idea of death and transience, but he really makes them look like dead, whales docked at sea, like almost. And also, if you watch what he captures, it's also this maybe a dead bird or the human body in great threat, working under conditions that are clearly unsafe. So it's pictures carry a lot more than a window to make a symmetrical bungalow access. And so we moved the offices elsewhere. And I really wanted a unbroken KMB to run the express office there. There was another collateral project called the Bricks project that happened in 2 of the floors. Yeah.
But
It's
makes so
but I
much
wanted
sense to have the-
and also this kind of the possibility to unfold different kinds of themes. So this is a graceful phone call. You have my access to sound. I have to find you. So, Tara Kelvin works with often very, very, again, seemingly simple device, mechanism. There are 2 works of hers in the show, one we'll see right now, soon after this. And so here what's very evident and visible is really there's a camera and it's sending its feed into a laptop, probably the next bogie of a train. So they are distant in space and hence create the distance in time. What I find really interesting about this piece is when a railway station arrives and the distance in space creates a greater distance in time. And as it accelerates, time converges. And it becomes almost a fragment of a second that splits between the back and the front. And to me that deflation and inflation and push and pull within the idea of time, or in fact in the idea of small time, was really interesting. A small fragment of time. The artist of course said this was her honest effort to travel time. And in fact opens up this kind of almost like a civilizational view of time with several citations. Like this is the only instance where we actually have an artist text. So Sudhir actually proposed that what he's written we should display alongside. There's actually so many cross references, right from Tatlin's Monument to the Third International, the Tower of Babel, there's several quotations, all of which is really a expansion of everything that he's done so far, because most of his works are really at eye level, at level of human contact in a way, and this really takes a flight. He cites works of fellow artists like Jyoti Basu. And the sound we are hearing is actually a spillover from Katie Patterson. And Katie's work, we can actually maybe go into complete darkness, but it's called, the piece is called Earth, Moon, Earth Sonata, and it's Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, beamed through Morse code to the moon and reflected back as Morse code with lost notes. And this few notes absorbed by the moon and returned becomes a distorted version of Moonlight Sonata. The work is slightly compromised, or extremely compromised at this moment, because the very next day after the exhibition opened, the bulb fused. So in fact the light in that room was meant to be a recreation of moonlight, worked with the German light makers Osram. And we just had one bulb from her, so in fact it was really sad. The bulb had to go into the same travel crate, shipped back to Berlin, and now returned in that same crate, and it's reached Kochi now as of day before yesterday, awaiting custom clearance.
Okay, so
We'll have it up, yeah. So the light, so the light will. Oh, this is the time I think I have to walk out and come back. Yeah, me too.
In a box, the changing nature of the water. It's quite really stunning.
It's really stunning. And sometimes it gets much just like it used to be in India different in the past. So the reciprocity of contemporary art with pedagogy, with the larger cultural field is immense. And that's dying out in Indian art colleges. So artists are struggling with an art history which they feel they have to continuously reconnect with. Whereas over here in Beacon House and places, there's already a Salima Hashmi kind of figure who connects a much larger, broader history, but there's also Rashid Rana who is globally circulating right now. So the students get that proximity on a day-to-day basis. And it's interesting because then you don't have hang-ups about technology, you don't have hang-ups about genres, which at least you see in art colleges here. People still struggling with, oh, I'm a painter, but I do this. Which, I mean, at the end of the day, why make such a big deal about it? And these people you can see have already transcended those questions. Then transforms into Vasco da Gama, and then he takes a boat and he goes off, waving to everyone. Now what's interesting is if you see everything looks like a cage, so he kind of caged himself, and he's got a compass and everything, and there you see he's left one bar open from which he escapes. One bar is bent. And what's quite amazing about his performances is that he's an artist who invokes his own past, his own ancestry of people in Kashmir who were in the ruling class. So landscapes meant property for them, you know? And so when he does landscapes, they're not merely seen as landscape painting of the colonial, ruins and things like that. These are landscapes that they kind of own. And he performs the kind of Maharaja kind of figure this is the artist, Nikhil. And he's one of the most accomplished performance artists in the country. And it's usually brought in as a transformative kind of process for him. Of him transforming into either a queen or a king or a civilian. Here, Vasco da Gama. Some of it was very animalistic kind. Actually interrupting people and painting something, and painting things over. And then some were very minute sketches over there. Some of it is actually reflective of what's across. Let's go to the next one.
They're actually trumpeters welcoming the king of Cochin. And behind them is the ship on which Vasco da Gama came, which is the Sao Gabriel. And on this side is an opium smoker because of the monopoly of the Dutch East India Company over the opium trade. But then actually he's also done these modern cargo ships and cranes and what you see outside the window over here. And connecting both the old and the new is this figure of the skull and death and saying that everything vanishes.
This exhibition invokes a lot of the iconography around maritime histories. It brings it not just in terms of the textual history, but in terms of the iconographies that circulated, and kind of brings them back as a renewed figuration in the art scene. That's why I think it's interesting that a number of works were new, because these artists are now rediscovering and reinventing some of these histories in its visual sense.
Interbeats are the first form of exchange.
Sorry?
Interbeats. First form of exchange that were used before money, for money came. But the funny thing is, Vasco da Gama has his mythic history. If you go to Belém, because Vasco da Gama died here, right? He was killed here. There was a local conflict. And his body was buried, of course, no one knows where the body is. So in the late 19th century, when Portugal was reproducing itself, they exhumed what they thought was the body. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. And they have a finger of Vasco da Gama in Belém, one finger. They claim. So it's like straight out of Tausig,
Right, exactly. This is the work by Sarnath Banerjee.
They worship Bolivar's snot in Venezuela. This is kind of mythic history as myth.
Sarnath Banerjee invokes exactly this in the work upstairs. Very humorous. We'll go to that. In which he's talking about this finger that is found. And they have committees deciding whether
Go to Belém and you see this really ornate church. It's really officious, commentary. And then you realize actually a finger. It's not Vasco da Gama's grave, it's a finger. I was telling her when I visited Belém, Vasco da Gama is buried there. And actually, it's only the finger of Vasco da Gama, which they claim to have exhumed from Kochi, which could be anyone's grave. Those days there were no dating and.
But Sarnath's work speaks of this. Sarnath's work somewhere speaks to this.
That's right. Yeah.
The seats, all that backside is actually seating, which then it's called the students' gallery because older people can't go up there. But then that same sort of seating becomes a roof, and it's made absolutely low cost with things like wire mesh and cement and old jute bags. So it's really made with very minimal material.
What's the name of the architect?
Vinu Daniel.
Vinu Daniel.
Sorry, you what?
Vinu Daniel.
Same college.
No.
So should we go into? So that's the app being used.
I wanted to download the app.
Tell us about this. Sorry, app.
So Posen now is tour guide.
We go in. Thank you. So Soren Pors is from Denmark and Aparna Rao is from Bangalore, and so they've been working together for close to 10 years now. You probably know them from Bangalore.
I know who they are.
And so work with actually, in this case, unlike say Sushanta, where the technology is absolutely minimal, and in fact the result is also kind of held within a small space of small technology and small experience, creating some kind of even philosophical thought. Here, in fact, the technology is actually very complex, whereas it looks very, very simple. So the 4 works almost like a portfolio of 4 suggestions. One is a trembling hand that can't hold a piece of paper. The other is actually a disc that rotates 2 sides, and actually the rolling disc, almost like the sun, moves from left to right. If you were in choppy waters and looking through a captain's viewfinder, your horizon would do this, and that's really aligned to the horizon outside and actually goes in and out of sync with the horizon outside. But then you also have something like the Teddy, which is the closer you get, it becomes as close to an experience of a wonderful starry sky. And the beauty of the work is actually that it has this very dominant singular light source in the belly of the Teddy, and it's delivered through these sort of simple fiber optic that's what it's called, the plastic tubes that actually deliver this to the edge of the skin of the Teddy. So every time there's a movement, it actually creates a kind of stellar vibration kind of situation. So and the 4th, of course, is a moving shadow of the sun. Which technically could never happen.
This place was such a wreck that I actually sent them a WhatsApp video saying room 1 trembling figures, room 2, and literally hoped that they would see the vision. And they immediately got back saying, perfect, this is the space for us, which was a huge relief. I didn't want to create 4 rooms, and I just felt it was ideal if they could just move into kind of existing, so this was really a mess. You couldn't get in. It's like all broken down. So we built just these 2 walls to control the whole install. So the blink is really natural. just our movement and the movement of the teddy, because these tubes are going all the way into the light source. And so which is why it's so beautiful. It's and hence complicated to make. It feels as after there is remove. The light is entering the body, and it almost feels like and then it also maybe even becomes like an urban scape from here, no? It's you kind of go away. It's like the top of the back of the teddy becomes almost like a city lit up or something. It becomes another kind of starfield. Sahaj actually was the longest resident artist in the sort of biennial premises. So he was there almost all the time that I was here, for 6 months really, and began working in the site itself, in the space. So very early on, I had offered him this space as this sort of laboratory. This actually is a laboratory. And Sahaj just took on this really complicated, one of the largest spaces in the biennial, like with open arms, kind of, he wouldn't leave the space. And in fact, a lot of these shapes and forms, which could actually in some ways look like images from a long gone subterranean past. In fact, maybe an invocation of Muziris, one might think of it that way. Although he doesn't, nor do I make that immediate reference. But in a way, like this unearthed old image that comes through. But equally, some of the others look like, in intergalactic space debris or, images from a sort of distant future. And they kind of seem together in this space. So it's actually really a big act of sculptural, kind of indulgence with material that comes from leftovers from film crew, who normally is the ones who use the space, and they really ransack all of the venues when they leave. They just really, they paint walls red. Like in August, all of that section was red inside and yellow outside. So but Sahaj was really repurposing all those leftovers really well. So all the junk they would leave, you would gather, and that's really the raw material for the shapes.
And he was inspired by abandoned monuments in Yugoslavia, medical tools, all kinds of things. So it has an entire range of references, all captured, relics, whatnot. Star Wars, Darth Vader, and everything.
Exactly. Right, from the surgical to the agricultural to the scientific to the laboratory, just mutants, Yeah. Almost like mutants from some other.
Mutants,
peculiar aliens. So there's the science fiction.
And it's got a clinical quality because of the space.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's
like
a laboratory. And used as one, because really I think he was just testing the limits of what he could do with sculpture. And so there's one breathing sculpture. It's a video there.
And this was a place where things were sifted, no? Like I think seeds, or was it grains that were imported?
Possibly, we don't know why the lab sinks are. So there must have been several forms of processing as well.
What's happening here?
I think Aspinwall had many trade interests. So I think, in fact, in its recent avatar, of course, must have changed many hands before. In the 90s, whoever ran the company, actually there are sections of this building, the last wing, that are call centers. So I think right from being warehouse and storage, the last spaces in the galleries actually, clearly you see, like
wires and
like modems.
What was the live performance? It says that.
He's not yet performed. I think he's just finding his breath. So we had actually announced it as something he would do, and I think he really wants to return back about a week ago. He often performs with the sculptures he makes. So I think it's just. The biennial is,
sort of pretty open-ended as a space, and in fact there's several elements like Navjot's work, for instance, which I don't think we'll get to today. There's a reference to a climate change chart, and there's always this thought in her mind and my mind that somehow that information is integral to the making of the work and it should be out there. But then information is really not great, as you know. And so it was interesting that she had begun installing the work here. She went to Berlin for a seminar and finds a co-panelist who's actually written extensively on this particular chart. And so they got speaking, and Navjot records with her cell phone. And 3-4 days into the opening of the exhibition, she and I discussed this, and we see this thing on the cell phone. Now that's a video that's playing in the space. So in fact, all of what she wanted to share actually is spoken by the man, totally met by chance. So in fact, there's this constant evolution, I think, which is quite central to the idea of even working with the model of a biennale.
And working with artists.
Working with artists,
and
like an ever-emergent set of themes and ideas that you try to capture in real time. So, for instance, my talk with Hamad a year ago in Hong Kong was exactly what I was thinking on that day, or in June somewhere else. So every institutional stop was really talking about the biennial in the shape that I saw it on that day. And so it's just been a journey of, because it's also evolving in like 80 studios at the same time. 94 studios, but some of them are existing works. So, but yeah, so huge numbers.
This makes artist curation is very special too. Curatorial projects by artists. It adds a very special quality of processes that are taken very seriously, not just the outcomes. And to somehow place those processes in the site of its reception. I don't know, it's happened every time. I mean, both biennales, Rutz's curations. Somehow a lot of artistic curations somewhere place the process quite centrally into the exhibition.
I think there's some, like I was asked, I did a talk recently about 3 weeks ago in Goa, and I remember the person who I was speaking to obviously knew that we were having huge resource crunch and all of that. So he was thinking there must be really terrible stories to tell, and was kind of prodding me to say, just don't be politically correct, tell me what is, But it's true, it's absolutely true that what we experienced was really outbursts of empathy. We had like 2 electricians, and like Christian Wahlvogel sitting 5 days waiting for his projector to come on. This place doesn't have electricity, so it's all wired up and pulled for the occasion. So in fact, until all the earthing is not right, you can't even switch on the beamer. So 5 days, Christian was just like sitting calm, friendly. Where do I go get a beer? It's really that kind of support. And I think just maybe there's this feeling of some kind of companionship when you arrive and artists are taken aback that it's a team as small as this, and so just everyone's kind of helping out. I had other artists who installed saying, now tell us what we can do, so it's this incredible spirit.
I think in the opening of the last Biennale, there was a big conference. Someone was saying if this was a curator curating that Biennale, they'd be crucified by now because things are left incomplete, and you don't allow curators to do that. With artists, you give that space, I guess, for I don't know.
Yeah, I wonder, perhaps. It's just, but also the scale. I think it's not just a curator or artist. I think it's just, a lot of artist colleagues actually arrived on the ground and saw that 8 venues were being activated. CSI Bungalow came into our possession 5 days before the biennial. We've been speaking for 3 months, not 6 months, actively, but the final documentation, etc., gets concluded. Our painters enter the space, changing yellow, pink, and green rooms into white, literally 5 days before. So, so artists who are installing there are actually very aware of what's being turned around in 5 days. So it all seems really magical,
So how long were you here?
About 6 months, yeah, and always departing from here. So I had commitments. So when Johnson and I would have met on some of them, on occasions, talks and conversations in various places. I always leave from here. I often say that I had more clothes in Kochi than in Bombay. I'm traveling out of here and returning here, occasionally going back to Bombay. The first 6 months were mostly traveling internationally, really meeting artists. Yesterday we had Vanessa Branson, who spoke about Marrakesh, the founding of the Marrakesh Biennial. We had 2-day seminars yesterday, so we had a lot of interesting, of course, Ashish was here. I'm saying we had lots of friends and colleagues the last 2 days with the seminar. And yesterday we had Vanessa Branson speaking about Marrakesh Biennial. And today we have Roger Bjorgel speaking about Documenta and his Busan Biennial experience. So it's been really nice. Lots of dialogue every evening, literally.
You're at it non-stop, huh?
Yeah, every evening there's a film screening, so that also keeps the pavilion warm and active. Every evening there's activity. You can go ahead. Go here first.
These two photographs are so amazing.
This is actually a separate project, and I requested Christian if we can actually have this as a kind of doorway.
That's a great, good idea.
This is an earlier work. So it's actually shot both with a normal camera and an astronomical camera. The astronomical camera reverses and makes visible the movement of Earth and tells us that that's a static sky or the stars are actually static. This is a normal camera shot from the same spot. But in a way, the rest of the project plays with this whole notion. And in a way, Christian's work is an act of verification. So he actually convinces the Swiss Air Force after a whole year to allow for him to prove that he was actually doing it right and the speed was more or less accurate was actually a chance thing that they said that if they can take one plane, they can take the second one. Because they were anyway breaching airline laws. They were actually exceeding the permissible speed limit. So the second plane then became for him a sort of pinhole camera through which he took that photograph. So the plane became the camera that shot the sun. If they were not moving at the speed of or static in relationship to the sun, you would actually have a streak. So that's the proof. This is a procedure, and that's the view from the aircraft on the other side. So in fact, we won't actually get to Pepper House today as part of our walkthrough, but there's Peter Roselle's work, which actually pretty much kind of stitches the center of that venue. And that's really an open violin case from which bulbs fall out. They're actually small light bulbs, almost like a doppelganger to Mona Hatoum, but they're in one line. They blink really fast, and it almost looks like they're just simply blinking until you go to one end and see they're blinking away from you or towards you at very high speed. That's calibrated to the ground speed of Cochin, which is around 437 meters per second, faster than the speed of sound. So literally the speed of Earth under our feet is faster than the sound of our voice going to each other. And Peter Roselle's work is actually a real animation of that experience.
Yeah,
so that's the kind of central, it's very small, it's almost invisible if you enter the room, there's nothing because it's all on the floor, but that kind of stitches that whole space together. So in a way, Christian's work kind of speaks to that other piece. So they maintain the speed for 4 minutes, completing one latitude. Piece of which unfortunately we don't have at this point when we go down. It's actually one of the smallest pieces in the show. So when he came here, he actually had this vision of India as a map bent to the curvature of India on the globe. So it was aligned to the same curvature with Kochi oriented upwards, because that's how we always imagine we are. Anyone, where's America right below? This always we are on top. So you actually align Kochi on top. When you do that directed north, the north of India goes 124 kilometers below the horizon ahead of us. So that was a work that just actually marked out experientially where Delhi probably is located, just like diagonally. So it's a very small piece. So that's another work from Christian. So in a way for him, I think it's really important to kind of upturn experience a little bit.
Is the one you had in your hand last time?
No, I don't have this.
This is the work of Zhu Bing. Many of you may be familiar with his work. And Zhu Bing's work actually references that the watercolor. In a way, a watercolor derived from a moment in the 15th century when a lot of Chinese navigators were known to have arrived in Kochi at the moment of navigation, like Zhang He and figures like that. So he actually kind of points to a navigational history to pick a piece of work from a certain period. But we can actually just go around. shadow. There's no pigment, there's no paint. It was interesting that there was a lot of natural debris from China that came from the studio, but then the studio assistant gathered material from here. Kind of the artwork as both now. It is actually Shubing's signature. And for those of you who may know his work, it's actually written in English in a calligraphy where English text looks like Chinese script. Shubing.
Oh yeah, oh my god.
He was created early on, I think 1998, the exhibited, we were exhibiting at the same time, Fukuoka Triennial. He has this entire script with yes, that's right. And also in Guangzhou, when I was showing the Guangzhou Biennial was when Shubing had, I think, a much smaller version of this, 2006 edition. So.
And then recently he's done that Phoenix, which is phenomenal.
Yeah, huge.
You must have seen it, right?
Yes, yes.
It's out of Massachusetts.
And also the solo in Taipei was quite good. At this point, of course, the resources have all disappeared, so has the map. But it looks like a time lapse of all of the world's navigation as it begins, because you have a full map of the world that gets consumed in the course of 9 minutes or so. It's projected at the dimension of a particular Mappa Mundi, which measurement that she had sent us. So it's scaled to a particular Mappa Mundi.
Was it meant to be pixelated?
I mean, it is made a little. I mean, yeah, it was. I mean, it is the video as we got it. It's file size is the same. It's played on an HD projector. So also, I think the blurring happens because it's not in real time. In real time, you would have clarity. This is either slow motion or speed would then blur it. So this is a lot of speeding up, no? Yeah. So till everything disappears, a bit like the Yan Zhengzong rice cones. Actually, two pieces. Of course, one of the largest paintings in the show is N.S. Harsha. A kind of sweeping, form of the endless loop, perhaps one single brushstroke that winds into itself. It's called Punarapi Jananam, Punarapi Maranam, which in Kannada apparently means afterlife, after death. It's Harsha's mother tongue. And it's really this almost as if the entire universe was swept in a brushstroke. It's really a magical, maybe it's an act of calligraphy in a certain way. But seen alongside Yoko Ono, with a Yoko Ono instruction, which is the instruction from the few instructions she made as artworks. So in fact, this one says, listen to the sound of the earth turning, as a postcard. And in fact, most of the instructions were actually to be processed as experience. So if you read the line, that was the piece of theater that you created in your mind as you read it. So these are the takeaways. You can take away the postcard, and we have a post office on the Biennale side. So my people have been using the post office now to sort of send. It's a lovely idea to have a post office. And it's been actually very practical because people are buying books
and
posting it, or catalogs and things like that.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's a very good idea. So that's the app launch. I think still going on. That's the app launch. But this is artist Mohandas Pradhan, artist from Sri Lanka, temporarily based between London and Sri Lanka this time. And Mohanad does these absolutely beautiful drawings. And when he came to Kochi, of course, it's a reminder of his own hometown Gala, which is the Ogol, which has a Dutch colonial history, and he saw a lot of that in Kochi in a way. And so for him, the seas became the same sea, and he began drawing the Kochi Sea as he shot them through gaps and fragments in windows or broken walls. And those shapes that he found in the photographs, all his photographs were like a viewfinder. Those became the shapes within which these drawings were made of horizon lines. and also once again aligned to the horizon outside. In a way, the horizon also recurs in multiple works in different ways. Right from the Porson Rao, Turbulent Horizon to the David Horowitz Sunrise and Sunset Horizon.
What's the work with the
tightrope?
that's actually
Janine Andoni, again, she trained herself to walk the tightrope, to walk that, make the work. It's simply outside her home in the Bahamas. As the entire weight of the body descends into the center of the rope, it briefly touches the horizon. It's projected to the exact scale of her body. So it's a measured projection and sort of aligned to the horizon outside. So in a way creating certain relationships. I was just saying that when you have the same texture and this beauty, but you would have another kind of beauty maybe. Maybe go to Wellington Islands and have 10 warehouses, or I don't know, and maybe have buses that take people between Fort Kochi and Ernakulam. We don't know. If it comes to that, but the hope is that this can become a permanent site if possible. Maybe government's intervention, yeah. There is that hope to see that, But if not, maybe there are other avenues. Maybe it can completely reset the vocabulary for future editions. So, with the stones. So this is. Wait for the friends to arrive. This is the piece we were just speaking about earlier, Cecil Tola's piece called Fear. It's because the smell is probably evident now. There are moments when the smell is really intense. It depends, I think, on the temperature and the moment of the day. It completely fills the building they're on sometimes, and other times it's kind of subdued. But of course, if you touch it, then you would have human odor on your fingertips. It's a kind of recreation of sweat. And she's worked extensively with scientists, and I don't know what the component is that creates a certain kind of smell, but there's a study that says apparently that at moments of anxiety there's an inflection to the kind of smell you have. Maybe to do with these different peptides, or I don't know. But so she actually, that's the work she normally does here. There was a conversation between us where I actually wondered if she'd be open to the idea of actually having them on these ballast stones. So these stones actually come from Holland, balancing ships as spices returned on the same ships. And in a way, it speaks to the moment that the next video speaks to, which is Wendelin von Oldenburg. Maybe we'll just pass through those corridors. It's a reading of this Governor Moritz, and letters being read out, letters dispatched from the Dutch West India Company. At the same time, the East India Company were obviously making gains here in Cochin. But the first projection in this sort of two-room projection actually is a reading of the letters. You actually get the voice of the man. In the very next room, the same group of people, many of them residents of Holland, several from Brazil, multicolored group of friends of the artist, etc., start analyzing those letters. And in those analysis, it goes straight from this very sort of, colonial views of what a distant people might appear like to a, colonizing governor, to then becoming a conversation about visa, laws, language, job opportunities and migration. So it actually completely shifts Stena in the very next room. So it goes deep into the past and then suddenly becomes the present, and also becomes an analysis of the man's, These are Kaderatia, and these are African and Middle Eastern states. Stamps issued post-independence in a peculiar reasons, perhaps. They all connect to images of space travel. There's one more piece in the exhibition at Darbar Hall, which is the last venue, where again the image of a stamp comes up. And there too, it's stamps and nations and borders that get animated, but through the image of Nizmul Qazi, the poet, who of course was somebody who resisted the whole idea of partition, but all three countries, Bangladesh, Pakistan and India, issue commemorative stamps separately in his honor at a time when he himself was kind of, paralyzed and unable to even communicate. So that's the work of Naeem, artist based between Dhaka and... So in a way that's another piece where the form, so in fact the cell phone perhaps appears twice, or the shadows appear 4 times, or stamps appear twice, etc. But sometimes again corresponding to completely different elements within the stamp, but again to do with borders and nations. That's in Darbar Hall. Yeah. And that's got a very that space has a very different texture, because it's a beautiful, like an art venue, like really a beautiful museum space with wonderful lighting. So it's got a different tone, texture, temperature. Really. So there's anyone like one from Hong Kong also there. That's fine. Excuse me. Hello. Excuse me. Okay, this concludes our partial walkthrough. But I was just about to sort of take leave only to ensure that we're set for Roger's conversation. So I'll just get into the AV and find Roger and just connect up. So in fact, Mithika will continue for the next maybe half an hour with you, if that's okay. And and just to speak very loosely, upstairs there's Navjot Altaf, where essentially a single climate change graph becomes almost like a 3-dimensional space within which her research, each book in fact has one page which has a notation, a piece of research, or the name of somebody she's spoken to around the notions of climate change. There's Khalil Raba with a wonderful photograph called Byproduct, a boat at sea shaped perhaps like the Gaza Strip, and Shen Shizhen from Taiwan, who actually reflects on the relocation of an entire leprosy patients, people with Hansen disease, relocated into a single sanatorium, and just as they settle into a gated community, they were uprooted. And he kind of reflects back through the life of 4 figures, like protagonists, laying back those 4 stories in 4 rooms. But for me, what is interesting is right in the middle of that space is actually one is a bird's eye view of that sanatorium space, now become a railway terminus. On the other side is actually a slight projection of the inside of the skin of Hansen disease, almost like a map from inside the skin of the body. And I think there's also once again a pause of 10 moment, when really you have a topographical view of human activity, but also something under the skin. as well. So I think that's somewhere in the heart of Shen Shizen's work is again maybe a reincarnation of the very first image in the show. But the exhibition goes on. I think now we've probably covered a third, and maybe if everyone's free, we can get together at Rogers Talk at 6 p.m. Yeah?
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Very
you.
intelligent
Thank you.
show.
Oh, thank you so much.
Very intelligent show and beautiful and poetically put together. Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's give him a hand. Our best introduction to Kochi. Thank you.
So see you soon.
We give him a hand again.
Yes.